Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our ongoing discussion of popular culture in the 1960s. In our final lecture in this series, we're going to be looking at a number of different forms of culture, beginning with alternatives to the mounting popularity of rock and roll music in the 1960s, and other aspects of culture that represented the clash in culture in the 1960s between conservatism on one hand and the growing counterculture and youth culture on the other. While the youth of the 1960s were consumed by the Beatles, the Stones, and other rock and roll artists, throughout the 60s many in Middle America and those older than their teenage years continued listening to more traditional music. The Lawrence Welk Show reached its heights of popularity in this period. Welk was a German-Russian product from North Dakota. He had popularized a musical variety format in the 1920s, and by 1955 was hired by ABC to host his own Saturday evening program. By the late 1950s, Life magazine called him the most popular musician in American history. Welk ignored the most recent musical trends and had his band stick to polkas and old-style dance music. His show maintained high ratings throughout the 1960s. To many Americans, Welk and his band represented a kind of extended family, a fixture on television, playing reliable songs in a reliable style. Performers on the show were folksy and friendly, often looking into the camera and giving a knowing wink. Still, his popularity tells us something about the 1960s. He offered a form of comfort in the storm, a calm and quiet in the middle of the chaos of that decade. In a constantly changing world, Welk remained the same, and he appealed to that large portion of the American population that didn't participate in the drug culture, hippie culture, or counterculture. Similar sentiments are demonstrated by the popularity of folksy rural television comedies like Hee Haw, The Andy Griffith Show, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres, and the Beverly Hillbillies, among others. Mockingly called hayseed television, no genre had a larger following in the 1960s. As we've already noted, some of these shows replaced the more controversial and edgier shows like the Smothers Brothers and Laugh-In. Another source of this kind of conservative entertainment came in the increasingly popular men's magazines like Male, Man's Story, All Man, Real Men, Man's Action, and others. Offshoots of the pulp industry, these had huge circulations of up to 250,000 per month in the late 1960s. While the exact readership is unknown, as one editor commented, "We were reasonably sure our readers drank beer." They were also interested in combat, and World War II stories and other combat stories were a favorite subject. A common tactic was quote-unquote true accounts that were almost always fabricated. It was not uncommon for the magazines to receive letters pointing out an error in one story or another when the whole story had been made up. The covers were also very important. They usually fed upon fear of enemies, fear of animals, fear of women, any attack on the reader's manliness. While the magazines were strictly censored to allow them to be sold openly at newsstands, an increasingly common theme came to be either abuse of women or abusive women, such as Madame Torture or the Nazi she-devil. The covers did allow for scantily dressed and large-breasted women and played on a sadistic undercurrent in popular culture. Some historians suggest these magazines encouraged male aggression about the growing tide of feminism. These magazines also suggest a revitalization of the male image and the restoration of a dominant male in American society. The tug-of-war between conservative culture and that of the counterculture was also reflected in film. Films of the mid to late 1960s lacked any definitive identity, and filmmakers struggled to understand what made a hit movie. Blockbuster epics like Spartacus from Stanley Kubrick in 1960 and Dr. Zhivago from David Lean in 1965 were smash hits. But similar films like Cleopatra from Joseph L. Mankiewicz in 1963 and The Bible from John Huston in 1964 were busts. Family movies like Mary Poppins from Robert Stevenson in 1964 and The Sound of Music from Robert Wise in 1965 were huge hits. Dr. Dolittle from Richard Fleischer in 1967 flopped. Searching for a more successful formula, filmmakers of the 60s opened themselves to different subject matter, like the Cold War, race, and the sexual revolution. Some films reversed the Cold War trend of the 50s, depicting red-baiting men like McCarthy as dangerous, rather than the liberals he prosecuted. One such film was The Manchurian Candidate from John Frankenheimer in 1962. Others, like Dr. Strangelove from Stanley Kubrick in 1964, depicted grave concerns over the possibility of nuclear war. Another genre that challenged earlier preconceptions was the Western. John Wayne was at his peak, and there were plenty of Westerns of the 1960s celebrating traditional heroism. But increasingly, Westerns began to look with skepticism on the old formulas of good versus evil, and clearly defined heroes and bad guys. The best representation of this is the series of spaghetti westerns that raised Clint Eastwood to stardom. A Fistful of Dollars in 1964, For a Few Dollars More in 1965, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in 1967 became iconic films for this rising star. Eastwood represents the ultimate loner, the man with no name. He tries simply to survive in a harsh, forbidding landscape. Other films took on the changing racial situation in the country. The popular film To Kill a Mockingbird in 1962 was based on Harper Lee's popular novel and kept the issue at a historical distance as it was set in the 1930s. Atticus Finch, an admirable Alabama lawyer, defends a black man accused of rape. While the black man dies attempting to escape from prison, the moral lessons of the film are more positive, as the general theme is one of social conscience. Also in the 1960s, black actors took on a widening range of roles. As Sidney Poitier wrote, the image of the black man just scratching his head is changing. Poitier's own career was a notable example. A top actor since the early 1950s, Poitier became the first black man to win a Best Actor Oscar for Lilies in the Field in 1963. In his films, Poitier pushed the boundaries of acceptable black behavior. He at times addressed issues of blacks working among white women and of interracial relationships. In one of his most controversial roles, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in 1967, his role involved an interracial romance. The white family of his fiancée struggles to accept him. And in the Heat of the Night of 1967, an award-winning film, he played a black detective teamed with a white partner attempting to solve a murder mystery in a southern town. His character in the film insists on equal treatment, even in the racist South. He famously insists in one scene, "Call me Mr. Tibbs." In another, after being slapped by a white man, he slapped the man back. This was one of the first movies to depict a black man hitting a white man. In the end, though, the film did not overturn the traditions of racism in the South, and Poitier's character ultimately was not the hero of the film. In fact, in some ways, In the Heat of the Night was thought to pave the way for a series of films celebrating the, quote, hillbilly from hell. Films like Easy Rider in 1969 and Deliverance in 1972. Popular culture also reflected the sexual revolution in the 1960s. In 1959, the Barbie doll made her debut. Barbie revolutionized the doll industry, as she represented a full-grown woman as opposed to a baby. While some questioned her exaggerated proportions and her obvious consumerism, the pressure of girls to buy the dolls was overwhelming, and Barbie became a cultural fixture for decades to come. In 1960, the sexual revolution entered a new phase with the introduction of the pill. In 1962, Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl became a smash bestseller. While she largely reinforced traditional gender roles, Gurley Brown did encourage women to enjoy their single lives, to postpone marriage and enjoy sex. This was a radical position, encouraging single women to have sex. Also, movies of the late 1950s and early 60s more freely depicted sexual situations. The old guard of movie makers was retiring or dying off, and a new breed with more innovative thinking was on the rise. Also, in 1954, a man named Jeffrey Sherlock became the director of the Hollywood Production Code. Sherlock had greater appreciation of adult content than his predecessor, and thus allowed greater depiction of sexual situations on screen. By the late 1950s, virtually anything short of nudity, sexual perversion, and venereal disease could be shown on film. By the 1960s, even those restrictions were pushed. One ploy was to produce films based on best-selling novels that broached sexual topics. One example was the film Peyton Place, made in 1956. Based on Grace Metalius' sensational novel, the novel contained just a few racy scenes, but it addressed the fact that women in a small New England town had sexual needs and desires, and the town was a place of dark secrets, teen abortion, abuse, and hot gossip. The movie version accentuated every suggestive scene and contained much more sexual content than the book. This formula was played out successfully several more times in the 1960s. A similar theme is evident in the James Bond series, based on the novels by Ian Fleming. Between 1962 and 1971, 6 of his spy novels were brought to the big screen, and again, any opportunity to introduce sex was taken advantage of. Still, the women in the films were strong, athletic, independent, free, and sexual. While remaining within the production code restrictions and keeping the women in lingerie, the Bond films still pushed the limits of what could be shown on screen. These examples, and many others, demonstrate that in the 1960s, popular culture pushed the boundaries of what had been previously acceptable or unacceptable in terms of women's place in the world and civil rights. And yet, as we've seen, those breaking through barriers in the 1960s remained the exception rather than the rule, and an era when true equality on the screen and on television and throughout popular culture for both blacks and women and other groups would still remain decades in the future.